Welcome to The Conversation. I am Kwame Thomas, and tonight we're tackling school violence in Jamaica. Joining me for this episode is Dr. Deon Edwards-Kerr, Senior Lecturer in the School of Education from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. So we'll be diving into the causes, the societal impacts, and the roles of parents, schools, and the government. Welcome to The Conversation, Dr. Edwards-Kerr. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you.
So it has been making the rounds in the news for quite some time now. Crime, violence, and that's not really the issue that we want to look at. It's now the fact that it's in schools, it's in our classrooms. And so we just want to start by perhaps getting an idea as to what are some of the root causes or the broader issues, and you have been a researcher in this field for quite some time, upwards of a decade. And so, based on your own research, what are some of the root causes of school violence in Jamaica?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is you say now as if it is just happening. And that's not the case. When that's not the case because I think we've always experienced some level of violence in our schools. And the fact that we live in a society that is where violence is endemic, then invariably that spreads into the schools. You think about it. What we have are children and young people going into a school setting, which is usually, we say it's a safe haven. They carry with them their knowledge and experience from their families, from their homes, from their communities, from their neighbors. And what do they carry? They carry the knowledge and experience of violence with them. So that is brought into the school system, into the school setting. But it's not just the children, is it? Because everybody who walks into a school carries some sense or some experience of violence or some knowledge of violence with them into the school. So conflict, which is already part of how the society is operating and why we, in terms of the kind of dysfunction that we're seeing in relationships and in how people relate to each other, that is brought into the school system. So what we then have is, in truth and in fact, the school is sterile until the people who go to school and work in schools enter the school.
So based on what you have just said, it reminds me of a publication that you had made probably some 11 or so years ago, where you had stated that violence is not native to the school, it's an import. But so based on that now, do you believe then that it's primarily as a result of poor parenting practices, or what other deeper societal and systemic factors are at play now?
I think the issues are too complex to narrow down to any singular thing. I think the complexity is the overlapping sort of circumstances and conditions that people face. So if you look in communities and, some communities are more structured than others, and communities that are a little less structured tend to have a little bit more violence.
So it's about structure then?
Well, structure is one thing. So that in those cases and in those schools, you do find higher incidence of violence. But that is not to say that because you go to an inner city school, there's more violence. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying that is it is happening in all schools in some form or the other, because if we're only defining violence as physical, then we're missing half of the issue. The other half of the issue is the violence that is not physical, the violence that is verbal, the violence that is the subtle forms of bullying, the violence that is turning out to be the symbolic violence that is built into the structure of even how schools work, in terms of even the procedures we use. So something happens in a school between some children and we move from 0 to 100. We move from 0 to a suspension. There is no in-between. There is no therapeutic approach to dealing with violence, into any kind of conflict or any kind of violent behavior in school. It's a zero tolerance approach, which we have taken, says that there is no other option but punishment for people who we classify as children and young people, yet we say we have this role as the adults in the situation for care and protection,
So then it's
for
a case,
nurturing, for development.
it's then a case whereby therefore the adults are not equipped enough to deal with this issue, so therefore they give half-baked solutions to issues that they don't understand then.
Not equipped, not trained, right? I believe that is the case. I think also we're in an era of education and schooling where people think that the professionals in the situation actually believe that their role is simply to do one thing, and that's to deliver content. But if education is about changing behavior, about modifying behavior, about raising a particular kind of citizen, but then chemistry knowledge, geography knowledge, Spanish knowledge alone cannot raise that citizen. It means that there is something that we ought to be doing in the context that help young people to understand why is this behavior not appropriate. Even though you come with it and you've known it all your lives and you see it inside your community and you see it somewhere else and you see it on the TV and you hear it in the music, inside the school system, what are we doing in terms of helping them to understand? How do I figure out why this behavior is not appropriate, why this is not the right thing to do in this situation? But when we move from 0 to 100 and we say, well, we'll expel you, we'll suspend you, to what end? Because it means that what we've taught them something in the process, and something that doesn't allow them to deal with conflict and to be able to resolve those things.
So I'm hearing a number of things. So as an educator yourself, the question that comes to mind now, do you think that our expectations of teachers are too high, wherein we want to have them teach, yes, but in addition to teaching, just the delivering content, we want structure, we want all those other things, and persons have said it's unfair to make such a request of teachers, of educators, but you seem to be saying that it can't just be a case whereby they're simply delivering content. So
that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm actually saying that when you think of the profession and where it's coming from and what it's supposed to do in society, if you think about it, what are the key pillars that build a society? We have families, we have communities, we have church, we have schools, right? We have law enforcement, right? So each stakeholder has to play their part in the process. And if you think about it now, if family and community fails, so if the home and the community fails, church fails because people literally aren't going to church, and the children now come into school, and school simply teach biology, teach chemistry, and send them back into the dysfunctional homes, communities, you name it, whatever relations are there. What then happens to that citizen? Who do these children and young people become? Who teach them about what needs to happen? How do you need to behave? Who teach them that? Who teach them that this is what you did, and do you understand why? So when we expel them and we say, okay, you can't come back into our schools because this is what you did, do we think that they've actually learned about why what they did is so fundamentally wrong and so fundamentally violation in the space? Do they understand that?
take me back to the section where we spoke about structure just a while ago. We spoke about the communities not being structured enough, and we spoke about schools having better structures, or some schools being more structured than the other. What does that mean, and how does that play out in your everyday society?
Well, the way I see it, and I'm going to use the COVID situation as an example, the way I see it is that schools are a fundamental socialization buffer, right? And if you look at it, what happened during COVID, the children were out of schools for probably 24 months. And what happened when they went back into schools?
Social awkwardness,
the
social
awkwardness,
anxiety.
the anxiety, all those things that school literally is a buffer. There are certain things we do in schools that we take for granted in terms of the structure, in terms of standing in a line. You want something, you stand in a line. You want to enter your classroom, you stand in a line. There are certain times when you are to speak. There are ways in which you are to acknowledge somebody else. Turn taking that needs to start from as early as you are 2 or 3 years old. Turn taking. Something as simple as that.
Let's go to our first break. Hold that point. And you're watching The Conversation. I'm speaking with Dr. Deon Edwards-Kerr. We're looking at the state of violence in our schools. We'll be right back.
Start your mornings off right with TV6 Morning Edition. Accurate, trusted, all the breaking news taking place on the Twin Island Republic. Don't miss TV6 Morning Edition, live at 6 a.m. in the Eastern Caribbean, 5 a.m. in Jamaica on CeenTV.
IMC Sports Max, we've got a front row seat to the biggest show in town.
It's time we get you prepared to travel with us to Paris for the 2024 Olympic Games.
He sat down with his coach Glenn Mills and they charted the course forward, and the rest is history.
En route, we will provide you with insights, news and analysis.
We need to do the work properly.
13 weeks to the start of the 33rd Olympiad. We've got you covered. Catch Le Baton Wednesdays at 6 p.m. on Sports Max.
Welcome to Campus Vibes.
We've got in-depth interviews with teachers, students, and administration, shedding light on campus vibes. Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m., 7:30 p.m. ET on CeenTV, the preferred eye to the Caribbean.
Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before we went to the break, you're helping us to understand the whole idea of the anxiety, the awkwardness, the fact that they're not able to cue properly. Well, these are things that they would have forgotten. Couldn't it just be simply a case of learning loss?
Remember now, learning is, you have different types of learning. So we have cognitive learning and we have behavioral learning. We have learning that enhances emotional and social skills and build pro-social skills. So that's really what I'm talking about in terms of the development of our children and our young people inside the school space. To what extent are we facilitating the development of those pro-social skills? The big word, socialization, right? So if school is not a socialization facility, for want of a better word, what is it then? If it's only to teach content, then why is it education? If education is only about my geographic knowledge, why is it education?
So then what you're asking for is a redefinition then of how we approach schooling, or is a return to?
It's a return to. It's a return to what education is supposed to be to a society. If education is one of the key pillars in the society, key socializational pillars in the society, are we really delivering on that, on the goals of that? And what I'm saying is, COVID proved, without a shadow of a doubt, in my mind at least, that schooling provides a fundamental buffer for a lot of children in terms of helping them to understand how to grow up as a citizen.
So we have stated earlier that you have done extensive research in this area, among others. And so your research would have revealed something about parenting styles in Jamaica. Is there any insights that you can share with us about the current state of parenting and its impact on children's behavior, especially in light of what you just spoke of?
Well, children learn a lot of things from their parents. That's the first set of socializers. And we already know that a lot of families, a lot of homes are affected by all sorts of issues that create the dysfunction, that we're not managing conflict in our families very well, and we see it in the domestic incidents that occur quite frequently. And so children would have had those experiences in their homes. And then imagine now if that is compounded when you experience the community. So parent, to me, what might be missing is some parents' understanding of how to hold our children accountable. It's important that when your child is wrong, they're wrong, period. And I'm not talking about throwing the children under the bus. I'm talking about you did this, so you're accountable for the consequence.
So could we then argue, though, that the parents here aren't adequately equipped to manage their children's behavior and their emotions, and that's one of the reasons why they face these particular kinds of challenges?
Yeah, yes, to a certain extent, I would agree. And I've seen in other places, in other jurisdictions, where there has been heavy emphasis on parent training. We've seen a lot of that here in Jamaica. For example, use of Webster Stratton parent training to help parents to understand things like that. How we hold children accountable for their behaviors, and how we continue to facilitate their growth after such an incident. So I think a lot of that is missing. In terms of parents, one, having the know-how, and two, having the time.
Why the time, though? You said know-how and time and space.
Because I think with some of the things that parents, if you think about it, for want of a better example, let's take a security guard who's working 12 hours or 18-hour shift. And you have two children going to school. Those children get into all sorts of scrapes. Who is there to say, this is what you did, this is wrong, and help that child to understand and bring the child to account? Who is there to do that? The child goes into the next day without the consequences, because consequences are important to stem certain behaviors. So if a parent is not there as the guardrail to ensure that the child deal with the consequences, what then happens? That child takes that into school, that knowledge, that experience. So once something kicks off, what happens?
So I don't want to be siding with any particular group or any one of the stakeholders, but the teachers, yes, sometimes we say, you stated that the expectations of them aren't necessarily too high. It's justifiable. But when you have a child that's coming into the school with that kind of a challenge that you just experienced or just stated, where his or her father or mother, security guard, 18-hour shift, 15-hour shift, or as the case may be, and he's probably the eldest, or he or she, that child is the eldest, and you have two siblings that you have to take care of as well, and you can't be held accountable for your actions because there's no one to supervise the whole thing.
Right.
You're going into school, the teachers know they have a curriculum that they have to deliver, and as a result of that, they're busy teaching to the test. How do we help to remedy this kind of situation now? Because the homes are failing and the schools necessarily will fail because of what the expectations are.
Okay, so one of the things we've recommended, particularly with the social and emotional and the behavioral issues, because some children do have behavioral disorders, they've gone undiagnosed, and those things are playing out in the context as well. Some children have other kinds of difficulties that are not being diagnosed, we're not figuring out. Children are coming into school with post-traumatic stress and anxiety and depression. We're not figuring out, we're not sifting out who has no right to be misbehaving. So for example, I would say my son has no right to be misbehaving, because he knows right from wrong and he doesn't have an issue. But there are children, and it may be, given the level of violence in our society, a number of them who might simply be suffering from all kinds of stress, having witnessed violence, experienced violence, or whatever the case may be. But how do we know? We don't know, because the personnel we have in schools and the personnel we have attached to schools can't diagnose those issues. So in truth and in fact, what we've often recommended is, you know, a multidisciplinary team with your social worker, with your clinical psychologist, school psychologist, with your occupational therapist, who can then figure out the child is referred. At this point, we don't have a system where a child is identified and the teacher says, you know, that child is going to pop off, something is going to happen. That teacher does not have an option to say, let me refer. You can send the child to the guidance counselor, but the guidance counselor's hand is almost tied when that guidance counselor is, what, 1 to 200 and odd in terms of a ratio. When do I get to this child? When do I get to do an assessment? Am I trained to do this? Who do I refer this child to?
But who's going to be paying for all of that, though? Because what you're describing is it seems like utopia, where, you know...
Is it?
Well, I'm just wondering.
Or is it that we're trying to think about how we raise the kind of citizens we want to get? What is the outcome that we want? Because if things like these are too expensive or too utopian for us to think about figuring who is dealing with an issue that the school cannot deal with, or how can we get this child assistance? Because sometimes teachers recognize that there's Kwame, and somehow I figure in this term something is going to break. And the teachers see it, but have nowhere to go with it in terms of referring that child for assistance. So if you send the child, for example, to child guidance, you're talking about a long waiting list to get any kind of assessment and then to get any kind of intervention. So really, if we begin to think, to move away from the notion of punishment and everything being in the system punitive, to a more therapeutic approach, where we try to identify early, with an early identification system that allows us to have the teachers say, listen, Kwame needs help. Have Kwame referred for assistance. Early in the term, early in his life. Then Kwame can get assistance along the way.
So it's cheaper.
It's cheaper in the long run. That's the point I'm making.
So you spoke about, so based on discussions that we would have had outside and here, I'm now of the impression, well, I've always held that belief where punishment is punitive, but discipline tends to be behavior modification. But then you spoke about the schools earlier and saying that they're moving from 0 to 100 in the snap. So the schools tend to be reactive. So the question now is, how effective are the current approaches that are used by schools to address violence and to promote safety?
Well, I'm going to start with the safety. Certainly not promoting safety by expelling children for 5 days and 10 days. You think about it, a 5-day suspension is 30 hours of lost learning. If you are having 6 one-hour classes per day, a 5-day suspension is 30 hours.
You know what? Let me hold you on that.
Sorry, it's 20. Yes, 30 hours of lost learning. So, where do these children go? They go home and do what when you have suspended or expelled them? What do they do?
All right, so let's hold that for a second. We go to our second break. You're watching The Conversation, where I'm speaking with senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Deon Edwards-Kerr. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back.
For your weekly gospel news, music, and entertainment, join us on CeenTV, your preferred eye to the Caribbean, for the premiere of the Gospel Report on Mondays at 6:30 p.m., 7:30 Eastern Time.
Hi guys, I'm Natasha DeBoul, aka the Classy Chef, and welcome to Momstration. If you can't eat a lot of spice, I could give it a pot, you know this.
This is really good, Natasha. Very nice.
Since we have Momstration, right? So next season, we could have Dadstration.
Can't forget it, Dad.
So join me as we go into the kitchen, helping frustrated moms.
Informative, reliable, entertaining, whether here or abroad. The Jamaica magazine keeps you up to date on the latest events happening in our little island home. Be in the know with the Jamaica magazine. Weekdays at 6 p.m., 7 Eastern Caribbean time on CeenTV.
Welcome back to the conversation. Just before the break, we started looking at the school's inability to deal with or to promote safety effectively. You were saying just now.
Well, it's the issue of the suspension and the expulsion.
And 30 hours at home.
30 hours at home, not doing anything, or if it's a 10-day suspension, you know, not doing anything. How does that help that child? How does that facilitate the development of the kind of citizen that we want? And that's really my point, you know.
But what if the teacher decides that it's in the best interest of the entire class now to exclude that one student?
You can exclude them on the school campus.
What if that child is disruptive then?
So that's what I'm saying. So that's the point I'm making now about the graduated intervention, the graduated approach. So there are some children who definitely they can take 3 days cooling out somewhere and getting the reintegration intervention that they need. And then some who might have deeper issues which have not been diagnosed. Those are the children who need to be referred for help. Most of them need help. Is something happening? There is something happening in their lives, in their minds, that is triggering some of these things and some of these behaviors. They have learned some of the behaviors. It has become normalized for them, but there's an initial trigger. But we're not figuring it out.
So just a while ago in the paper, we saw where they spoke about the implementation, the metal detectors in school. Do you think that's a truly effective method of preventing incidences, or they seem to create more problems than they cause? Because when you go into some schools, no. So let me use my own experience. I remember going into a particular school and at the front there was a metal detector. That's one. When you get in now and the securities did searches, and you search the students while they're going in, and I saw a marijuana cigarette, we call them spliff. That's one. I saw a condom, and I saw a number of things before I actually got to a book. And I'm thinking that where are these students going? You know, if you have all those things before I'm able to actually find the book, you know. So tell us a little bit about the whole idea of the metal detectors, and because that school looked like a prison when I was going there, and I was just going to visit somebody.
So if it looked like a prison to you, what do you think it feels like to the students? No, it's a serious question, you know. What does it feel like to those children and young people in that context? What does it say to them about who I am as somebody in a critical development stage? If I am having to go through a metal detector, I am in a school, and I've seen schools like that you're talking about, schools with the decorative blocks for windows that are then barbed wire. So I know exactly what you're talking about when you say that. So what does what signal does that send to the students themselves? Do you think they will, going through a metal detector and having the scissors that you're carrying taken off you, because they do have those things, and that's not that's an open thing. After they've had it taken off them, what do you think they will do next? Figure out, well, I shouldn't have carried it because the metal detector is going to pick it up. They find different ways to carry a new one.
So we're sending the wrong message.
So they're not learning.
We're sending the wrong, the messaging is wrong then.
The messaging is wrong. The learning. You see, if schools is about learning, at minimum, if you leave with no subjects, you should at least learn how to operate as a good citizen.
So we argue then, bring back civics in school. you know, bring back civics, values and attitude, do you think those programs in and of themselves would be sufficient to actually help to stem the issue that we're having?
I think teaching other subjects, no. I think really, a lot of these things have to be modeled, you know. The behaviors, good citizen behaviors have to be modeled. So if it's not being modeled at home, it's not being modeled in our communities, is it being modeled in our schools so they know this is how you operate? And there are always going to be some children who say, you know what, I don't like these regulations. I am going to go against the grain. You always have that set. So we have to have approaches to deal with those children who are resistant, defiant, if you want to put it that way. But for the average student, what we want is to be able to teach them, how do you grow up in a society like this so you can contribute and so you can be a good citizen? You notice I keep saying that because invariably, violence is a breach on the notion of being a good citizen.
But what's a good citizen, though?
But a good citizen invariably does not try to do harm to others or create or damage people's property. A good citizen understands the rule of law.
But so my thing is now, we look at the stakeholders, but even before I get to the last three, the first two, inside the homes, inside the communities, we're busy trying to survive, not to thrive, not to grow, but literally just to survive.
True.
And unfortunately, for some, you know, I might have more children than I thought I would have been able to manage because, let's be honest, what my father would have earned when he was my age, where a one income could manage both the whole household, and he could pay a mortgage, he could do that now. Me and my partner, two incomes, and you need to find additional sources of income so that you can survive. Now, unfortunately, we might have two children, you know, whereas somebody else might have one, but we're struggling just to barely survive. We can't get by, so you find that the house, the home, the family is struggling. The communities, therefore, are struggling. Now, when you go to church, we're busy trying to figure out what we can do for this week, how we can survive in this other week. So the things that we collect from church has nothing much to do with, okay, how to be a good citizen and all of that. It's really about what I've tuned out, because I go to church so that I don't have to hear the noise of what else is happening around me. Or I send them to church, so church becomes a crutch. So when you look at those three, you know, law enforcement, they're there to be reactive to.
I doubt that.
You know, I'm just saying sometimes that's how it looks. So school is the only one that's left.
Well, the conception of law enforcement I'm working with is a law enforcement that is part of the community. And our JCF has tried that, the whole business of community policing. And you notice that when we had school resource officers, you said
when we had?
Yes.
It's no longer there.
Well, I don't see them in the way that they used to be there. When we had school resource officers going into school, they actually came out of the community branch of the police.
That's the district constables and those individuals.
Not just district constables, officers as well, but that's where they came from. So the law enforcement is a part of the community. And yes, families are struggling in many ways, and that's why I talk about the issue of time. And the structure of the family and how families have to be working. But at the same time, when you think about it, it's inside that family and inside the context of the broader community family that we actually define particular kinds of behaviors. So if it fails, or the behaviors that are coming out of that quarter of the society are maladaptive, malformed, or antisocial, who and where else in the society is going to pick up that slack? So should all quarters of the society fail? So you keep asking the question about parents. So parents are just one facet. One facet. Parents are part of a broader community. And one of the things, as in my analysis, is that children learn some of these behaviors. Where will they unlearn them?
Well, yeah. So as an educator, it's difficult to not see that unlearning is just as important as
learning. Yes.
All right. But tell me about collective responsibility then, because it seems as though we're headed into that particular direction. How can all these stakeholders collaborate effectively to support students and create safer environments?
Well, the first thing is that we all have to take responsibility. It's not school fault. It's not just the community's fault. It's not the police fault, and it's not church fault. We are all responsible. That's the first thing. That's a starting point as far as I'm concerned.
So when the Minister of Education stated earlier that the issue, one of the causes for the violence in the schools is because of the music, how do we respond to that particular claim then?
Music is art, and art reflects the society. I don't know any art that is sterile and divorced from the society. So if you listen to the music all the way back to the 60s into the 70s coming in, the music was always telling us that there was violence in our families, in our homes, and in our communities. The music was always telling us that. That art form was always reflecting what was happening. And so what we're hearing now in the music is what is coming out, what they're seeing, what they're living, what they're understanding. I don't think they're making up these situations. I think they're reflecting what they see.
So in my mind, it's a little different. It's a little bit more cyclical in that the art will imitate life, will imitate art. So you will live what you hear, and you speak of what you have lived. So yes, I'm not siding with the minister, the honorable minister. I'm also saying that yes, it plays a role in how you reinforce certain kinds of behavior. But the artists as they may be, they're literally singing their story, which sometimes is our story, or collectively, they are singing our story. And so when you hear that, it's almost preaching about depression, or preaching about you being depressed to a group of persons who are also depressed, and so you don't have a solution to offer. But how do we pull ourselves out of that and sell hope?
So let us talk about solutions then.
Yeah.
All right? So if we say it's the music, what's the solution?
It can't be for band music.
Precisely. If we say it's the church, what's the solution? If we say it's the schools, what's the solution? It is all of us. This is on all of us. Every single, especially the adults, the significant adults in the situation. It's on all of us in terms of how we think about children and young people and their development. What is it that they need at 2 and 3 and 4 years old? What do we need to be teaching them in terms of behaviors, in terms of emotion regulation, in terms of how they think about themselves and other people? What do they need to know at 13 and 14 and 15 years old as now somebody who is moving further into adulthood? What sort of behaviors do I need to be displaying? Are we modeling that for them in the society? What are we saying to them through the media, the airwaves, and the things that they have access to? What are we saying to them? So when you think about it, if we place blame on any one sector, it means we don't have a solution, because it's too complex and too intersectional for us to be thinking that it's here and not there. It is all of us. Even the very regulations in the school system are part of the symbolic violence that is perpetrated on our people.
So that's something that I definitely need to have a better understanding on, the whole idea of symbolic violence. But I'm going to go to another break now. You're watching The Conversation, where we're talking about the state of violence in our schools. And I'm speaking with senior lecturer from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, Deon Edwards-Kerr. Continue to stay with us. We'll be right back.
Let's explore Jamaica's life and culture, top artists and their hit songs, fashion, food trends, and so much more. Free this Fridays 6:30 p.m. on CeenTV, the perfect eye to the Caribbean.
Rise and fellowship with CeenTV, your preferred eye to the Caribbean. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Andrew's Memorial premieres on Sundays at 6 a.m. Eastern Caribbean Time, 5 a.m. in Jamaica.
Get ready to meet the world. Discover new places, lifestyles, and cultures. Ours is a place full of intrigue and insight at every turn, and it's all at your fingertips with travel access. Premiering Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., 7:30 Eastern on CeenTV.
Welcome back to the conversation. Just before we went to the break, I was about to ask, we can then put forward that there's no solution in sight. And here's my reason.
I'm not saying
that.
No,
man, I'm not saying that you're saying nothing. But my reason for saying that no is because everybody's blaming the other. So it's their fault, not our fault, but it's their fault. And so it seems to me that we're in a position where we're kind of void of ideas now as far as solutions are concerned. But you said something about symbolic violence. So before we get into what I just spoke about, tell us a little about what that means and how we can fix that.
Well, you remember earlier I said if we only look at violence as being physical.
That's just half.
That's just half the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because we also have the verbal, but we also have the symbolic in terms of the procedures and some of the regulations that govern the system. And for me, one of the biggest forms of, and when I talk about symbolic violence, we're talking about procedures and regulations that say who can be included and who can be excluded. Who should we punish and what should we punish and what shouldn't we punish? And what does this tell people about who they are and how they operate in the context? Mm-hmm. What is it in the context that is actually bearing down, bringing a burden onto the teachers and onto the students that is causing conflict? What is it in schools that cause conflict between teachers and students that then escalates? So a lot of times is the way how we structure the timetable, is the way how we teach, the methodologies that we use or not use. For things like, you have students in your class who learn in so many different ways, have so many different intelligences, yet we only teach one way. It means that we automatically exclude some people. We punish them. But
being a subject matter expert doesn't mean that I'm able I'm not a content delivery specialist. I'm literally just a subject matter expert. So
No. If you're a teacher, then you have pedagogy. You have...
That's why I didn't say teacher, I just say subject matter expert.
Yeah, well, but just to go back to the point really in terms of what we mean by the symbolic violence and how some things in the context benefit some and disadvantage some. Mm. And that's important, and children see that, the children and the young people see that. And they are already crying out for we want justice in their own way. That space becomes a space of conflict. So the other thing now is that we because it is our responsibility, can't then only, that's what we've been doing, looking at only one type of violence and blaming that on one part of the society without trying to understand what is the nature of the violence, how it arises in the context of school, who is supposed to handle it, who de-escalates, how do we de-escalate? So we see a lot of situations all the time flare up with students and teachers. When the fight occurs with a student and a teacher, who is to de-escalate? Whose responsibility it is?
No, my assumption is going to be the teacher. That's going to be my...
But why don't some people understand that? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And Is it that they're not trained to do so? So we have to look at this more holistically. It cannot be that it's one section of the society and that it is the music, or it is this, or it is the parents, or it is that. It is all of us.
So is it accurate then to make the assumption that the maladaptive behaviors that we're seeing in the classroom, these are, as you would have stated earlier, these are a part of the collective cry for justice?
Yeah.
So they feel disenfranchised. They might not know how to communicate. It's almost like a child not being able to speak, and there's a gripe, and so you cry, and you cry to get attention, so that the hope is that that person who is going to tend to you will be able to understand the issue. Because when I look at it, firstly, there's some difficulty that parents will have, or some persons will have, in terms of sending their children to get an assessment. It tantamounts to what we do now, where as adults, we're afraid to go to a counselor.
Right.
Because me don't want nobody say my mother. Now, when I'm sending my child to an assessment center, not because the child is performing poorly, but literally because I want to know if the child is okay, or how can I make this child better. Then I still don't want to think that, I don't want anyone to think that my child is crazy. How do we first get over that particular hurdle, and then what are the responsibilities of those different stakeholders that you spoke about earlier?
So we again are in terms of dealing with these really negative stereotypes around mental health, and mental health among youth in particular. And I think because we have those stereotypes, a lot of young people don't get help. So we only know that they need help when they have actually committed the suicide. Then it's too late. So right now, there are a lot of children and young people who just need somebody to talk through something with, who can reason through with them. But believe it or not, even as adults, oh, nothing wrong with you. You're all right. That is the attitude, because we say, as Caribbean people, as black people, we don't do mental health, ill health, but we do it. We see it every day, right? And so, really and truly, because we're talking about these things without actually trying to do something about how do we help these young people who are dealing with different kind of stresses, right? How do we help them? And one way to help them is to have those multidisciplinary teams that they can be referred to, is to expand the child guidance that they can be referred to, is to ensure that a guidance counselor can refer a child to get help, and you get help within good time. So you have an early identification system that is built into the structure of schooling. So once a teacher identifies, or a parent identifies, or a neighbor identifies, you know what? Kwame is a little bit off the rails. This behavior does not look right. I'm going to talk to the guidance counselor. Guidance counselor says, yes, I might agree with you. Let us have a meeting to see what's happening here. And if everybody's seeing the same pattern, not understanding what's happening, there's an option to refer that child to somebody who they can see in good time, who can make an assessment and have an intervention plan.
Do you think that society needs retooling? That's, I'm tempted, I needed to ask that question in light of what you've said.
I absolutely think so, because the level of antisocial behavior that we see means that we have missed the boat significantly, and from the early years, we've missed the boat.
How can we get back to that place?
It starts in the early years, but also in transforming the system, in transforming education. Think about the wider outcomes of education, and not just 5 CSEC or 10 CSEC, but the fact that part of the role of schooling is to create that good citizen.
So you're saying then that in our imagining, or reimagining rather, of what the model student, the model citizen should look like, we need to therefore identify clearly what are our expectations, what are our expectations of the students, and that's based on what we want society to look like tomorrow.
Yep.
Now, the church, the community, the law enforcement, home, where can we even start? What are some, based on your own research now, and we're just trying to modify what would the impact of, well, currently the impact on society is negative, but how can we fix that so that we can move forward collectively?
You know, in the School of Education at UA, there's been a program there called Change from Within for many years now. And one of the things about that Change from Within does, it does target some of these issues that it actually does in schools, is that Change from Within starts with a kind of a circle time, a conversation, right? A multi-person conversation, multi-stakeholder conversation that brings the issues to the table. And in many ways, that's really what we need on a societal level. We need that circle time. What are the issues that we really face in the communities? Where is the violence starting? In many cases, it starts in the homes. But go ahead.
But with all due respect, we are very good at crafting and having those conversations. You know, my issue now is that to transition from, yes, we have had the conversation, yes, we have crafted the policy, but now let us implement the policy so that we can see where it goes. I think that's where, so there's a dissonance between the conversations that we're having and the implementations of the policies that we have crafted. So how can we move from that section over there to, you know, because we're philosophers, we sit and we're like this for the most part, and we're thinking, but the world is moving. The boat that you just spoke about, it's sail gone. How can we catch that up?
Well, after taking responsibility, it means being committed to what we've taken responsibility for. And I think you talk about implementing policy, and that we might have policy, but we're not seeing the policy in action. So we're not very good at operationalizing policy, right? But it really is a commitment, and if you don't have buy-in, people co-opted into a commitment to actually make this happen, it won't happen. But it starts, believe it or not at the bottom and not at the middle. The commitment starts at the top. So even the way we speak to each other, the children are watching that. The way we speak to each other through the media, the way we speak to each other in across the political fence, the way a police officer speaks to the adults and the sorts of things we see that are reflected, all of those things are part of what the children are. But so we have to have a commitment to shift the way we think about how we relate to each other and the sort of values we want to display in our societies. But it requires a commitment, and a commitment requires that we take responsibility. All of us, all quarters.
Wow, Dr. Edwards-Kerr, it's a whole lot that we need to consider, and so they would just. And I'm not even sure where to start. You have for a second left me without words. And so we have come to the end of another insightful discussion where we just spoke to Dr. Deon Edwards-Kerr, Senior Lecturer in the School of Education. We looked at violence in school, we looked at societal impact, we looked at the role of all those stakeholders. And so I'm definitely going to state now for the record that we want to have you back for another discussion to see how we can start and how we can move forward from that conversation initially. So you are watching the conversation where we just spoke with Senior Lecturer on the University of the West Indies Mona campus, Dr. Deon Edwards-Kerr, about the state of violence in our schools, and we have looked at some of the ways that we can deal with those issues. Until such time, I'm Kwame Thomas, and you're watching the conversation on CeenTV, your preferred eye to the Caribbean. So we ask that you continue to watch us and stay informed and stay safe. Have yourselves a good one. The truth is hidden in the spaces between black and white. And here on The Conversation, we explore those gray areas. Here, it's not just news, it's conversation, direct, factual, and remarkably original. Keep up to date with the latest news around the region. Join The Conversation, premiering every Sunday at 8 p.m. 9 Eastern Caribbean Time, with a rebroadcast on Monday at 8 a.m. 9 Eastern Caribbean Time, only on CeenTV.